If we were to consider the imposition of an indirect tax, we can look to see the incidence or the burden of taxation and who that burden falls upon. There are two types of indirect tax. There are specific and ad valorem taxes, and so I'm going to start off by drawing a diagram to show the effects of the imposition of our specific tax. So we would start with a demand and supply diagram, as we would normally do if we were doing an application in this way. I'm going to assume that demand is fairly price inelastic, so I'm drawing my demand curve fairly steeply, and I'm going to draw my supply line on like so. So if I was to put my original equilibrium on, you can see that that would be PEQE. Now, the key thing to remember about taxation, certainly the imposition of indirect taxes or taxes on spending, is it is the producer that has to pay that tax on to the government when it is imposed. So, for example, if the government imposes a petrol tax of 3 pence per litre, then it is the petrol companies themselves that will have to pass that tax on. Now, obviously, what they do and what they hope to do is to pass on that taxation to the consumer in the form of higher prices, and then they're able to collect that tax on behalf of the government and pass that tax on to the government. And we'll certainly see when we look at ad valorem taxes that that's what's happening with VAT in the UK, and then the same thing happens on a statewide basis in the US with state taxes. So we need to consider that taxation is essentially a cost of production for a producer, and the imposition of a tax will increase their cost of production. And as with all other increases in costs of production, you will see that supply will fall. There is less of a profit motive. The key thing to remember with indirect taxes is that specific and ad valorem have different effects. So a specific tax is a unit tax, a tax per unit. So, for example, on bottles of wine, that might be 20 pence per bottle. I've already mentioned possibly 3 pence per litre. Air passenger duty, which is charged on flights, is a figure of £40 upwards, depending on where you fly to. And the same thing is used upon cigarettes and other demerit goods. So when that tax is imposed, the level of the unit tax is irrespective of the price. And so what we see is we see a parallel shift in supply to the left. So we will see the imposition of the tax happening. It will cause a higher price, which is what you might imagine would happen, and a lower quantity. Now, if we imagine that many of these specific taxes are put upon, or levied is the better word to use, it's what the government does, it levies a tax. The government likes to levy taxes on products that not only it knows it can raise quite a lot of revenue, but it might also do it because it wants to lessen consumption. And as you can see here, both production and consumption are going to fall from QE to Q1. Now, the key thing to remember is that the amount of tax, I'm going to do this in red so you can see it very clearly, is the distance, the parallel vertical distance between the two lines. So that is the level of the tax. What we can do now is create a box that, as you can see, has been split into two by the market price at PE. So if we were to call this lower level here P2, you can see that we have got a rectangle. I'm going to put some other letters on to help us out with our annotation. So we've got a rectangle, P1, A, B, P2. Now, the consumer was paying PE and is now paying P1. So as you should be able to see, they're paying the majority of the tax because they're paying the distance that I'm now going to put in blue here. So they're paying that amount of the tax, whereas the producer is paying the slightly smaller amount. Now, you might be sat thinking, why is the producer absorbing any of the tax? It's all to do with elasticity. The producer knows that if a price of a product goes up, it is likely to face a fall in demand, and therefore that is going to lead to less revenue potentially for them. So they need to consider whether they can pass the whole tax onto the consumer, the whole burden onto the consumer, or whether they will need to absorb some of it themselves. For most indirect taxes, particularly specific taxes that are imposed in terms of demerit goods, cigarettes, alcohol, due to the addictive nature of some of these products, and the same can be true of petrol because of the necessity nature of that product, most of the tax can be passed on to the consumer. But in this instance, not all of it has, only the distance that is shown by A to C has actually been passed on, whereas the distance between C to B has been absorbed by the producer. Now, it is at Q1 that there is new production value. So if we were thinking about the total tax revenue the government is going to get, I'll go back to my black, the government is going to get the whole box. So the government revenue is going to be P1, A, P2, B. So it's going to be the whole rectangle there. But from the consumer's point of view, they will absorb, and the incidence of taxation on the consumer is P1, PE, AC, whereas the producer is going to absorb PE, P2, CB, as shown by the downward hatch crossing there on my diagram. The government's going to get the whole rectangle, but the incidence or burden of taxation is split between the consumer and the producer. And a mnemonic to remember, COP, consumer over producer, if you're trying to remember which way round it goes. And please remember that you're drawing this up from the point that we are now at, Q1, and it is a vertical distance that you are looking for between the two parallel lines. Now, another good point that I would mention, and I'm just going to use my blue again just to illustrate that, if in the exam question you're given any ideas about any of these numbers, so you're told, for example, what PE was, what P1 now is, or the extent of the tax, then please use that to annotate in your diagram. But you might also be set a short answer question in the exam that might ask you to look and calculate some areas. So just be ready to apply your mathematical skills to this also.